You're 19 years old. It's December 7th, 1941. You're a seaman second class assigned to the USS West Virginia, a massive Colorado-class battleship nicknamed the Wee V. You've been in the Navy for 10 months, long enough to know the ship's layout by heart, but not long enough to have ever seen a shot fired. Your world is 32,000 tons of armored steel and 8 16-inch guns that can hurl a shell the weight of a car 20 miles. You don't know it yet, but in less than 60 minutes, this steel fortress will become a floating coffin for hundreds of your friends. It is now 7 a.m. You're below deck in the berthing compartment, a cramped space filled with the smell of floor wax and laundry starch. You're polishing your shoes for the morning inspection. Nearby, a sailor named Red is complaining about his winning streak at poker being interrupted by the Sunday schedule with no idea what will happen in 10 minutes. At 7:45, you head to the mess deck for breakfast. The ship is in a state of relaxed, so-called condition X-ray, meaning many of the watertight doors are open to allow for easy movement on a Sunday morning. For the guys that are still in their berthing compartment, those open doors will soon become their worst nightmare. The harbor outside is a mirror of blue water, with 7 other battleships moored in a neat line along Ford Island. It is the greatest concentration of naval power in human history, and it is completely stationary. And to Japanese pilots that are currently flying through the mountain passes, you're a row of sitting ducks. It is now 7:53, and you're on the aft deck looking toward the north. You see a flight of planes cresting the Koolau Range. At first, they look like the usual training flights from Hickam Field, but they aren't circling, they are diving. They are flying low, unusually low. You see the lead plane drop a long cylinder-shaped object into the water. It's a Type 91 torpedo, specially modified with wooden fins to work in the shallow 40-foot depths of the harbor. At 7:55 a.m., the peace of the morning is shattered by a deep metallic thud that makes you wet your pretty white pants. The first torpedo has found the USS Oklahoma, moored directly ahead of you. A split second later, the first of 7 torpedoes slams into the port side of West Virginia. The deck beneath you doesn't just shake, it heaves upward. You're thrown 10 feet into the air, crashing down onto the teak wood deck as a massive wall of water, mud, and fuel erupts over the side of the ship, drenching everything in a slick, black film. Red Sullivan is already on his feet, ignoring a gash on his forehead and heading for the ammunition lockers. The sky is suddenly filled with diving shadows. You look up and see the red circles on the wings. The Japanese pilots are so close you can see their goggles and the white scarves around their necks. One plane strafes the deck with 7.7mm machine guns. You see a sailor nearby caught in the burst. The rounds tear him apart. You scramble toward your battle station at the 5-inch anti-aircraft guns, but the latter is slick with blood and grease. You realize the officers are trapped or dead. The so-called invincible fleet is being slaughtered in its berths, and the real horror is only just beginning. It is now 8:05, 10 minutes since the attack began. The USS West Virginia is no longer a ship. It's a massive piece of leaning metal. You think the worst has happened, but you're standing on the doorstep of a literal hell. Across the water, the USS Oklahoma has finally given up. In less than 12 minutes, the massive battleship has rolled completely over. You watch, frozen, as her giant propellers rise out of the water. You can hear the frantic banging of sailors trapped inside the hull, screaming for help behind 4 inches of steel that no one can open. The harbor water, once a clear tropical blue, is now a thick black soup of fuel oil. Then, a stray incendiary bullet hits the slick. In an instant, the harbor becomes a lake of fire. You see sailors jumping from the high decks to escape the sinking ship, only to realize too late they've jumped into a furnace. They try to swim, but the oil coats their skin, their hair, and their lungs. They don't scream for long. You're struggling to reach the 5-inch guns on the starboard side. You pass a hatch where a group of engineers is trying to scramble out of the lower decks. Their skin is white and peeling, hanging off their faces like wet tissue paper. Leadership is gone. The captain is on the bridge, his stomach torn open by a piece of flying steel from the Tennessee. He's refusing to be moved, directing the counter-flooding to keep the ship from rolling over like the Oklahoma. He is literally holding his own intestines in his hands while telling the crew to keep fighting. Then comes the sound that ends the world. You're looking toward the USS Arizona, moored just a few hundred yards away. A Japanese high-altitude bomber drops a 1,700-pound armor-piercing bomb right where tons of gunpowder and shells are stored. The explosion is so violent that the 600-foot battleship is lifted clean out of the water. When the smoke clears, Arizona is gone. 8:15 a.m. The second wave of planes arrives. There are nearly 170 of them this time, and they aren't looking for ships anymore. They're looking for anything that's still moving. You finally reach an anti-aircraft gun, but it's jammed. You see a black mess attendant named Doris Miller, a guy who wasn't even allowed to train on the guns because of the color of his skin, step up to a nearby .50 caliber machine gun. He's never been taught how to use it, but he doesn't care. He clears the jam and starts scraping the sky. pouring lead into the diving planes. He is now the only thing standing between you and another strafing run. You look into the water and see men who have managed to swim through the burning oil and reach the side of your ship. They are covered from head to toe in thick, gooey fuel oil. You can't see their faces, only the whites of their eyes. When you reach down to pull one up, his skin slides right off his arm in your hands. He doesn't make a sound. He just looks at you with a terrifying, silent stare before sliding back into the black water. You look toward the USS Nevada. She's the only battleship that has managed to get underway. She's steaming toward the open sea, her flags flying and her guns blazing. But the Japanese see her too. They want to sink her in the narrow channel to block the entire fleet inside the harbor. You watch as 10, 15, 20 bombs strike her decks. 8:30 hours. The West Virginia is settling into the mud. The water is up to your waist on the port side. You're handed a bucket and told to help with the fire on the bridge. You realize that the Great Pacific Fleet you were so proud of is now just a collection of scrap metal and corpses. 8:40 a.m. The smoke from the USS Arizona is so thick it feels like midnight. You're standing waist-deep in water on the gun deck of the West Virginia. Because the water is shallow, the ship has settled into the harbor mud, preventing it from capsizing, but the deck is a slaughterhouse. The counter-flooding has worked. The crew opened the sea chests, massive intake valves at the very bottom of the hull, to let in thousands of tons of seawater on the high side to balance the weight of the torpedo damage. The ship has leveled out, but the main deck is now only a few feet above the waterline. You finally find a working .50 caliber machine gun near the aft mast. This is a water-cooled Browning. It has a thick metal jacket around the barrel filled with liquid to keep the steel from melting during the heat of battle. The sailor who was supposed to be manning it is gone. All that's left of him are his boots and a smear of red on the bulkhead. You don't have an officer telling you where to aim. You don't have a plan. You just grab the spade grips. The metal is so hot it leaves the pattern of the grip burned into your palms, but your adrenaline is so high you don't even flinch. You pull the triggers, and the gun bucking in your hands feels like it's trying to tear your shoulders out of their sockets. Above you, the sky is filled with Aichi D-3A dive bombers, also called VAL. They are easy to spot because of their spatted landing gear. They tip over into a 70-degree vertical dive, their engines screaming as they plummet toward the remaining ships. You've never fired at a living thing in your life, but as a VAL dive bomber sweeps low over the deck, you pull the triggers and don't let go. You see your rounds punch holes in the aluminum wing of a Japanese plane. It wobbles, smokes, and then cartwheels into the harbor, exploding in a spray of oil and debris. You look down at the water and see the men covered in oil again. Survivors from Oklahoma and Arizona are clawing at the side of your ship. It is now 9:45 a.m. The engines fade. You let go of the triggers, your palms raw and blistered from the heat. Ammunition belt is empty. The water jacket on your gun is hissing, the cooling liquid boiled into steam. The attack is now over. Japanese planes are gone and everything is silent. You stand on the superstructure of West Virginia, looking down at a harbor that has become a graveyard. The water is a thick bath of blood and Bunker C fuel oil. The casualty count is a number you can't yet comprehend. 2,403 Americans are dead. Over 1,100 of them are still inside the USS Arizona, which has settled into the mud as a massive, hissing tomb. You see rescue boats, small motor launches, and whaleboats crisscrossing the harbor. They are picking up the black ghosts, men so badly burned and oil-soaked that they have to be lifted by their clothing because their skin slips off at the slightest touch. The most haunting sound begins as the sun goes down. You are standing near the edge of your ship, looking toward the capsized hull of the USS Oklahoma. From deep inside the upturned steel, you hear loud noises of sailors trapped in air pockets using wrenches and hammers to signal for help. In West Virginia, the horror is even more personal. Deep in the lower compartments, in pump room A12, 3 sailors, Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, and Lewis Costin, are still alive. They are trapped in a dry room behind thick, watertight steel doors, surrounded by the bodies of their friends. They have a flashlight and a calendar. For the next 16 days, long after the world has moved on to the war, sailors on guard duty will have to listen to them banging on the hull, begging to be let out. No one can reach them without flooding the entire section. When the ship is finally salvaged 6 months later, crews will find their bodies and a calendar with 16 days crossed off in pencil.